The radio on James Carter's workbench hissed through static, cutting across the low rumble of September rain hammering the tin roof of his woodshop. He'd been sanding the final edge of a cherry credenza, commission piece for a lawyer in Aspen, when the call came through. Base to Carter. We've got a critical failure at the main pavilion. East-facing ridge beam is buckling under water weight. Structures compromised. James set down the orbital sander. The sudden quiet felt thick with the smell of tung oil and fresh sawdust. His eyes flicked to the corner of the shop where Emily lay curled on the old leather sofa, wrapped in the purple blanket her mother had knitted 4 winters ago. The fever had started that morning, low grade, nothing alarming, but it sat in his chest like a stone anyway. He keyed the mic clip to his shoulder. Copy that. Clear the perimeter and shut off the main breaker so we don't have live wires if the roof comes down. I'm on my way. Emily stirred under the blanket, her small voice cutting through the drum of rain. Daddy! James crossed to her in 3 strides and crouched beside the sofa. He pressed the back of his hand to her forehead, still warm but not worse. You okay, baby? She blinked up at him with Sarah's eyes, dark brown, wide, too observant for a 6-year-old. Are you going to save people? That's the plan. Mommy would want you to. The words hit him square in the ribs. He smoothed her hair back from her damp forehead and forced his voice steady. I know she would. Mrs. Davis is supposed to be here any minute to sit with you. Emily's mouth pulled into a frown. She called. The road's flooded by her house. James closed his eyes and pulled in a slow breath. Of course it was. Patricia Davis lived 3 miles down the valley, and the creek that ran alongside her property turned into a torrent every time the storms parked over the peaks. He opened his eyes and looked at his daughter. Then I guess you're coming with me. To the resort? Just for a little while. You can sleep in my office. There's a couch and I'll check on you every 20 minutes. Emily sat up, clutching the purple blanket around her shoulders. What if I get sicker? Then we go to the hospital. But you won't. This is just a bug, remember? Dr. Patel said your heart's doing great. James saw the flicker of fear in her eyes anyway. It was always there now, buried under her bravery, the memory of surgery tables and beeping machines and the months when every breath felt like it might be her last. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight. You're the toughest kid I know. We're gonna be fine. She pressed her face into his shoulder. Okay. He grabbed his canvas jacket, his leather tool belt, and the battery-powered track saw from the pegboard. Emily wrapped herself in the blanket and followed him out to the truck. The rain soaked them both in the 10 seconds it took to get from the shop door to the cab. James buckled her into the passenger seat, turned the heater on full blast, and pulled onto the muddy access road that wound up toward Mountain Ridge Resort. The storm had turned the valley into a study in gray. Low clouds clung to the ridgelines and the wipers could barely keep up with the sheets of water slamming the windshield. Emily huddled against the door, her breath fogging the glass. James kept one hand on the wheel and the other on the radio, listening to the frantic back and forth between his crew and the resort's event coordinator. By the time they reached the main grounds, the scene had gone from bad to worse. Guests in rehearsal dinner clothes huddled under the stone lodge's covered porch, staring out at the pavilion. The canvas and timber structure meant to hold tomorrow's 300-guest wedding was leaning hard to the left. The primary ridge beam had split down the center, and one more gust of wind would bring the whole roof down. James killed the engine and turned to Emily. Stay in the truck until I tell you it's safe. She nodded, eyes wide. He pulled his jacket hood up and stepped out into the storm. The original event contractor, a man in a soaked designer coat, was pacing through the mud, yelling into his phone. James walked past him without a word and headed toward the pavilion. He didn't need to get close to see the problem. The beam had been undersized from the start, and the contractor had tried to save money by using inferior-grade lumber. Now the whole structure was a liability. Then he saw her. Rebecca Mitchell stood on the covered porch of the stone lodge, ringed by anxious bridesmaids and frantic caterers. She wasn't frantic. She was perfectly still, arms crossed against the cold, watching the pavilion fail with the kind of detached focus he remembered from 3 years ago, when she used to analyze quarterly reports at 2 in the morning. She wore dark jeans and a navy sweater, her black hair pulled back in a severe knot. The diamond on her left hand caught the dim light from the lodge windows. James stopped walking. 3 years. 3 years since he'd walked away from her Denver apartment and driven back to the mountains because he couldn't stand the thought of dragging her down into his grief. Sarah had been gone 2 months. Emily had been diagnosed with her heart defect, but hadn't had surgery yet. James had been drowning, and Rebecca, brilliant, driven, terrified of commitment Rebecca, had been trying so hard to hold him together that he could see the cracks forming in her own armor. He'd heard her on the phone one night talking to her corporate lawyer about succession plans and board meetings. And he'd convinced himself she was trying to figure out how to extract herself from the mess he'd brought into her life. So he'd left before she had to make that choice. Now she was getting married to someone else, in a pavilion that was about to collapse. Rebecca turned her head, and their eyes met across 20 feet of rain-soaked stone. She went perfectly still. The phone in her hand tilted slightly, and her knuckles went white around the case. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. Every panicked voice behind her seemed to fall back into the background static of the storm. James forced himself to step onto the porch. Water dripped from the brim of his cap. "Rebecca." Her voice came out steady, grounded, with that slight rasp at the edges he used to hear when she worked too late and forgot to drink water. "James." He kept his tone flat and professional, the same way he'd talk to any client in crisis mode. "The pavilion's a total loss. The primary beam is compromised and the ground's too saturated for heavy equipment to brace it. You can't hold an event in there tomorrow." The event contractor shoved onto the porch, phone still pressed to his ear. "Listen, buddy, I've got $20,000 worth of imported white roses sitting in refrigeration, and a client who expects a mountain view altar by 4 tomorrow. We just need to prop it up temporarily." James didn't look at him. "If you prop that structure with temporary jacks in this mud, the lateral wind load will drop the roof onto your guests. It's a safety violation, and as the master contractor on this property, I'm red tagging it. Nobody goes in." The contractor swore under his breath and stormed inside to make another call. James could feel Rebecca's eyes on him, steady and unreadable. She rubbed her left temple. Old tell, the one she only did when her mind was running 12 failing variables at once. "He's right about one thing. I have 300 people expecting a ceremony tomorrow. My fiancé's executive board flew in this morning. If we cancel, it's a public relations disaster for him." James's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "The great room in the lodge is empty. It seats your guest list. It's dry, grounded, and safe. There's no altar in there. It's just an empty wooden room. I have a full lumber yard in my shop." The answer came before his brain caught up with what it meant. "I can build the platform and arch. I'll have it done by sunrise." Rebecca looked at him for a long second. Rain battered the porch roof between them. "You would do that. I'm the property contractor. It's my job to fix what's broken." She held his gaze, and something shifted in her expression. Something he couldn't read but felt in his chest like an old wound reopening. Before she could respond, a small voice cut through the noise. "Daddy?" James turned. Emily stood in the lodge doorway, purple blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her face flushed with fever. He crossed to her in 2 strides and knelt down. "What are you doing out of the truck?" It was cold and scary. He pulled her against his chest and stood, lifting her with one arm. Rebecca was staring at them both, her face unreadable. James met her eyes over Emily's head. "This is my daughter, Emily. Emily, this is Miss Mitchell." She owns the resort. Emily turned her head and studied Rebecca with the kind of unfiltered scrutiny only children possess. Are you the lady with sad eyes? Rebecca blinked. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She looked at James as if searching for an explanation he didn't have. Emily had a gift for reading people. Sarah used to say their daughter could see straight through to the truth of a person before they even opened their mouth. It had been unsettling then, settling. It was devastating now. James shifted Emily's weight and cleared his throat. She's running a fever. I need to get her inside and set up somewhere warm before I start working. Rebecca seemed to snap back into herself. There's an office behind the kitchen with a couch. It's quiet. I'll show you. She turned and led them through the lodge's main hall. Staff members hurried past with armloads of linens and frantic expressions. Rebecca moved through the chaos like she owned it, because she did. Her father had built Mitchell Hospitality from the ground up, and she'd taken over as CEO a decade ago when he retired. James had learned all of this 3 years ago during the 6 weeks they'd tried to make something work before he ran. The office was small and warm, tucked away from the noise. Rebecca flipped on a lamp and pulled a wool throw from a cabinet. James set Emily down on the leather couch and wrapped her in both blankets. She curled onto her side, already half asleep. He pressed his hand to her forehead again, still warm. He'd give it another hour before he started worrying in earnest. Rebecca stood in the doorway watching. Is she okay? Viral infection. Nothing serious, but she needs rest. You brought her here? I didn't have a choice. Babysitter got flooded out. Rebecca's eyes dropped to Emily's sleeping form, and something in her expression softened in a way James hadn't seen in years. She used to look at him like that, back when they were still trying to convince themselves they could work. I need to get started if I'm going to finish by morning. He kept his voice neutral, professional. Do you have the dimensions for the great room? Rebecca nodded slowly, then stepped back into the hall. I'll have someone pull the plans. James followed her out and closed the office door most of the way, leaving it cracked so he could hear if Emily called for him. Rebecca walked him to the front desk and handed him a rolled set of blueprints. Her hand brushed his for half a second, and he felt the contact like static. Why are you doing this, James? He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the exhaustion she was trying to hide. The same exhaustion he'd seen 3 years ago when she was trying to save him and herself at the same time and failing at both. Because 300 families need a safe place tomorrow. Same reason Sarah would have done it. Rebecca flinched at the mention of his late wife. Her throat worked as she swallowed. I'm sorry for your loss. I should have said that 3 years ago. You did. At the funeral. She shook her head. Not enough. I should have. Her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and her entire posture changed. She answered without looking at James. Yes, Richard. James didn't wait to hear the rest. He took the blueprints and headed for his truck to grab his tools. The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it had gotten worse. By the time he hauled the first load of cedar beams into the great room, his clothes were soaked through and his hands were numb. The space was massive. Vaulted ceilings, exposed iron trusses, flagstone floors, beautiful bones, but empty and echoing. He set the beams down and rolled out the blueprints on a folding table someone had left near the stone fireplace. The math came easy. It always did. He'd been building furniture since he was 16, working construction since he was 20. The pavilion failure wasn't his fault, but fixing it was his responsibility. That was the job. That was the promise he'd made when he took the master contractor position 2 years ago. It wasn't until he started cutting the first beam that he let himself think about what he was really doing. He was building an altar for the woman he'd walked away from. An altar she'd stand under tomorrow and marry someone else. The irony wasn't lost on him. By midnight, the great room smelled like fresh-cut cedar and cold mountain air. James had hauled in 6 rough sawn beams, set the altar platform over the uneven flagstone, and locked the joists down with structural screws. The impact driver echoed off the vaulted ceiling. He wasn't throwing together a prop. He was building a piece of architecture that would hold weight and wouldn't fail her. Near 2 in the morning, he climbed the extension ladder and began anchoring heavy-gauge string lights to the wrought iron trusses. They would fall behind the cedar arch like a curtain of warm stas. He'd seen a picture of the original pavilion setup in the event coordinator's portfolio. This would be better, sturdier, real. He climbed down, wiped sawdust from his hands, and checked the alignment. Then he heard the rustle of fabric behind him. Rebecca stood at the entrance to the great room wearing her wedding dress. James's grip on the pencil in his hand threatened to snap the wood in half. The dress was white and formal, cut clean and elegant with cap sleeves and a long skirt that moved over the stone floor in a quiet sweep. She held a bouquet of white roses in the crook of her arm. Her hair was down now, loose around her shoulders. Drop earrings caught the dim light from the work lamps. She walked the center aisle slowly, her eyes moving over the half-finished structure. When she reached the platform, she stepped up carefully. The wood didn't creak. It held her perfectly. James stood there in a dust-covered gray t-shirt, tape measure clipped to his belt, boots streaked with mud. The distance between them was less than 3 feet and wider than any canyon in the Rockies. Rebecca turned to face him under the string lights he'd just hung. A tear slipped down her cheek, cutting a clean line through the careful makeup someone had applied for tomorrow's photos. She didn't ask about the schedule or the construction timeline. She asked the only question that mattered. "Do you regret letting me go?" Everything inside James went still. The rain outside, the hum of the generator in the basement, the distant voices of staff preparing for a wedding that might not happen. All of it fell away, yes. The truth landed between them with no place left to hide. Rebecca's shoulders shook once, then settled. "Good. Because I never wanted you to." James stared at her. "But when you left Denver, when I left, I thought you'd gotten scared. Of my grief, of Emily, of all of it. I was waiting for you to ask me to stay. You never did. You just disappeared." Her fingers tightened around the bouquet. "I would have chosen you." The old belief he'd carried for 3 years, the one that said he was too broken, too burdened, too much, cracked clean through the middle. "I didn't know that. You didn't ask." She said it softly, without anger, just exhausted truth. "You decided for me." James opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the lights flickered, buzzed, and died. The room dropped into darkness. Emergency strips glowed faintly along the baseboards, casting everything in dim red. His radio barked to life. "Cooper to Carter. The main transformer on the access road just blew. The whole property's off the grid." James grabbed his headlamp from the tool belt and snapped it on. "Status on the primary generator behind the lodge." It tried to cycle on, but it choked. No power to the kitchen, no heat in the guest rooms. James looked at Rebecca in the low backup light. The rapid rise and fall of her shoulders gave her away. Cold air pressed in from the service hall, and 300 stranded guests suddenly became a practical problem, not an abstract one. "Stay by the wall. Don't move in the dark. I'll be back." He didn't wait for her answer. He ran. The rain hit like gravel when he stepped outside. The mud sucked at his boots as he crossed to the concrete pad behind the lodge and pried open the generator housing. His headlamp beam cut across the diesel engine. He didn't need a manual. He checked the primer bulb, soft, fuel pressure loss, probably sediment in the inline filter. He pulled the wrench from his belt, cracked the bleeder valve, and took the spray of diesel across his hands and jacket. The smell was sharp and oily in the freezing air. He cleared the sediment trap, tightened the valve, pumped the primer until the bulb went hard, then slammed the manual override. The engine coughed, sputtered, roared to life. 30 seconds later, the breakers engaged. Light flooded the lodge windows behind him. James shut the panel and walked back inside, dripping wet, smelling of rain and diesel. Rebecca was waiting just beyond the service doors with a stack of clean white towels. She stepped forward without a word and set one over his shoulders. He caught the ends in both hands. His fingers were numb from the cold. Her fingertips brushed his and stayed there for half a second, steady, deliberate. The room smelled like cedar, wet wool, and hot metal from the kitchen stoves coming back online. The shaking in his hands eased before he finished his first breath. Then her phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Her voice flattened. "Yes, Richard." James turned to leave, but her free hand shot out and caught his wrist. She didn't look at him. She just held on while she listened to whoever was on the other end of the line. "What do you mean the bridge is gone?" James keyed his radio. "Status on the lower access bridge? Washed out. Cooper River breached the banks. Concrete pylons held, but the wooden deck's gone. Nobody's getting off this mountain until the county brings in a temporary steel span, and they're not coming in during this weather." Rebecca lowered the phone slowly. The color had left her face. "Richard's at the helipad behind the golf course. He chartered a private Bell 407 out of Denver. He paid them triple to fly under the weather. A Bell 407 carries 5 passengers. James said it automatically, his brain running the numbers before he could stop himself. "I know." Her mouth went flat. "He's taking himself, the CEO, and 3 board members to Denver. The pilot has 1 seat left, for me. He expects me to leave my father, my sister, and 300 guests on this mountain so we can sign the marriage license in front of a photographer and protect the stock narrative." James said nothing. She needed to hear her own words. He said canceling outright would hurt the company. She gave a dry laugh with no humor in it. "Half my family is trapped here, and he wants a cleaner press release." She didn't cry. She walked to the steel prep table in the corner of the service hall and slid the diamond ring off her finger. She set it down. The stone clicked against the metal. "I'm not going." She turned toward James. The corporate armor was gone. She looked exhausted, frightened, and finally honest. She took 1 step forward. James opened his arms only after she crossed the last foot herself and pressed her palms to his sides. "Hold on to me." She did. He wrapped her up and braced her against his chest. It wasn't hunger or spectacle. It was shelter. Cold fabric, damp hair, the steady drag of her breathing against his shirt, and the simple fact that she had stopped shaking. He kept 1 hand broad across her upper back and the other at her waist, anchoring rather than claiming. "You're safe here." After a long time, she stepped back and wiped at her face. "I have to tell my parents. Then I have to tell 300 people. Take your time. I'll make sure the kitchen has the generator load they need to keep the food safe." James turned to go, but her voice stopped him. "Why didn't you call? After you left Denver, why didn't you ever call?" He looked back at her. "Because I thought I was doing you a favor, letting you go before you had to choose between me and everything else. I would have chosen you. I know that now." The next few hours were logistics and weather. Richard and his board members flew out at dawn. The sound of rotor blades beating across the valley felt like a line being drawn under her old life. When morning broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a hard blue sky, a cold wind, and a missing bridge. The resort was isolated. The guests were warm, fed, and going nowhere. Around noon, James was in the great room snapping latches on his tool cases. The cedar arch stood at the end of the room, solid, beautiful, and as far as he knew, useless. He assumed Rebecca was upstairs handling the fallout of a canceled high society wedding. His job was done. Time to get back to work and out of her way. "What are you doing?" He turned. Rebecca stood in the doorway wearing jeans and an oversized flannel shirt that looked like it belonged to her father. She looked tired, but the hunted look was gone. "Packing up. Then I'm heading down to the lower road to help the county assess the bridge. You're not going anywhere. Rebecca, you've got enough on your plate today. You don't need me hovering. I don't need hovering. I need execution. She came closer, her eyes moving over the archway. We have thousands of dollars worth of food prepped. We have a 5-piece acoustic band trapped here. We have 300 guests with no way down the mountain. Her voice strengthened as the plan assembled itself in real time. So we don't waste this room. We don't waste the food, and we definitely don't waste the archway you built. We host a survival dinner tonight. Guests, resort staff, county workers, anyone who can get here. James looked at her and saw the strategist he'd fallen for 3 years ago, finally aimed in the right direction. I need you to turn the lights back on, James, now. I want to use the space we built. He let go of the case and crossed to the panel. The dimmer slid up under his thumb. The string lights came alive in a warm gold sweep across the stone and cedar. I need an hour to finish sanding the left handrail. I left one rough edge. A real smile reached her eyes. Take your time. I'll tell the kitchen to start the fires. James went to check on Emily. She was awake, sitting up on the couch in the office, her fever broken. She looked small and tired, but her eyes were clear. How do you feel, baby? Better? She pushed the blankets aside. Can I help you? You can keep me company while I work. He carried her back to the great room and set her up on a folding chair near the fireplace with a sketch pad and colored pencils. She drew while he worked, long, quiet strokes of purple and gold. He glanced over once and saw she'd drawn 3 figures, a tall man, a small girl, and a woman with long, dark hair. Above them, a single star. Who's that? He nodded at the woman. Miss Rebecca. And that's Mommy. Emily pointed to the star. She's watching. James's throat tightened. He knelt beside her chair. You think Mommy would be okay with Miss Rebecca being here? Emily looked at him with Sarah's eyes. I think Mommy wants you to be happy, Daddy. She told you that. She did. Then it's okay. By evening, the great room had become something better than a reception. It was a warm, crowded survival feast. The catering staff turned the formal menu into a massive buffet. The band traded wedding standards for folk songs and bluegrass. Guests in expensive casual clothes shared tables with resort staff and county workers in wet boots. The whole room smelled of cedar, wood smoke, roast meat, and the last of the storm drying off coats by the fire. James stayed near the back beside a stone pillar with a bottle of sparkling water, watching Rebecca move through the crowd. She checked on the older guests near the hearth, redirected servers with a light touch, and laughed when a little kid tried to steal an extra biscuit from the dessert station. She wasn't performing. She was simply capable. Her father came to stand beside him with a glass of whiskey in hand. Thomas Mitchell was a retired judge with sharp eyes and a reputation for seeing through anyone who walked into his courtroom. Richard sent a legal notice to my email an hour ago, threatening to sue the resort for the venue deposit. Negligence, breach, the usual ugly language. James set the bottle down. He has no grounds. The contractor abandoned the site. The pavilion failure is documented. The bridge washout qualifies as an act of God. I have time-stamped structural photos, weather reports, and maintenance logs on the transformer and generator. I can pull the file right now and send copies to counsel. Thomas took a sip and looked at James over the rim of the glass. I know. I'm a retired judge. I already drafted the response. His mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. I wanted to see whether you'd reach for optics or facts. You reached for proof. James had no good answer to that, so he gave the truth. Rebecca shouldn't have to carry this alone. No, she should not. Thomas watched his daughter for another moment. She's never needed a man to rescue her from hard work. What she needs is a man who can recognize a real threat, stand his ground, and build something solid before everyone else finishes talking. He put a hand on James's shoulder, once, firm and brief, then disappeared back into the crowd. James looked toward the archway. Rebecca had stopped there beneath the lights, one hand resting on the cedar post. She found him across the room and held his gaze. No bright wave, no public performance, just one small nod that landed with more force than a speech. He walked to her. The band finished a song and the room naturally softened into quiet conversation. Rebecca stepped onto the platform and turned to face the crowd. "I want to thank all of you for making the best of a very strange day. We didn't get a wedding, but looking around tonight, seeing people share food, stories, blankets, and whatever else they had to spare, I think we got something better. We got a community." A murmur of agreement rolled through the hall. "But I have one specific thank you to make." She turned not to the room but to James. "Last night when everything was coming down, the man standing beside me didn't ask for a contract, a deposit, or a spotlight. He picked up his tools, secured the building, brought the power back, and built a safe place for all of us to stand." She reached her hand toward him. "James Carter built this, and I'm proud to stand beside him." She wasn't hiding him. She wasn't softening him for the room. In front of her family, his crew, and every important guest stranded on that mountain, she was making her choice in plain language. James stepped up and took her hand. Firm grip, warm skin, cedar under their feet. That was enough. He didn't make a speech. He just stood there with her while the room answered with applause. Later, long after the last guests had gone to their rooms and the catering staff had cleared the tables, the great room settled into quiet. Embers shifted in the fireplace, the string lights hummed softly over the arch. Cold pressed at the windows, but it couldn't get in. James and Rebecca stood alone beneath the cedar. Emily had fallen asleep hours ago, curled up on the office couch with her purple blanket and her sketch pad clutched to her chest. James reached into his pocket and brought out a small brass key. "My cabin's on the north ridge, past the tree line. Small place, wood stove, porch I built myself, quiet enough to hear the snow before it reaches the roof." He looked at the key, then at her. "I don't have a corner office, Rebecca. I don't wear suits, I build things with my hands. But if you want a place where you never have to wear armor just to walk into a room, the door is yours." Rebecca looked at the key for one steady second, then took it and closed her fingers around the brass. She slipped it into the pocket of the flannel shirt and pressed her palm over it. "I don't want the corner office. I want the porch." James lifted his hand to the back of her neck and let his thumb rest lightly at her jaw. She leaned in first, close enough that her breath warmed the cold line of his cheek, and her eyes stayed on his the whole time. James, that was all the permission he needed. He kissed her slowly, no rush, no spectacle, just the clear, steady arrival of something that should have happened years ago. Her hand came up to the side of his neck. His stayed, gentle and sure, cedar, wood smoke, soft light, and the old storm finally spent outside the windows. The solid fact that neither of them was running now. When they finally drew apart, she rested her forehead against mine and smiled in a way he'd never seen before. No performance, no armor, no negotiation, just Rebecca. The morning after the survival dinner broke cold and brilliant. James woke on the leather sofa in his office at the resort, Emily curled against his side under the purple blanket. Sunlight cut through the window in hard angles, turning the dust motes into suspended gold. His back ached from the couch springs and his hands were still raw from working through the night 2 days prior. Emily stirred and opened her eyes. Her fever was gone. The flush in her cheeks had settled back to normal, and when she sat up, she looked more herself than she had in 48 hours. "How do you feel?" "Good. Hungry. That's a good sign." James stood and stretched, feeling every hour of the last 2 days settle into his joints. Through the window, he could see county trucks parked near the lower road and crew members in orange vests surveying the washed-out bridge. The temporary steel span wouldn't arrive for another day at minimum. The mountain was still an island. He walked Emily to the lodge's main dining room where the kitchen staff had set up a continental breakfast for stranded guests. The room was half full, people in rumpled clothes nursing coffee and checking their phones for service that wouldn't come. Rebecca stood near the coffee station talking to her father. She'd changed into clean jeans and a gray sweater, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. When she saw James and Emily, she excused herself and crossed to them. "Good morning." "Morning." James nodded toward the buffet. "We're just grabbing something to eat before I head down to the bridge site." Rebecca crouched to Emily's level. "How are you feeling today, sweetheart?" Emily looked at her with that unnervingly direct gaze children possess when they haven't yet learned to lie. "Better." "Are you still sad?" Rebecca blinked. "I'm working on it. Daddy says when you're sad, you should draw pictures. It helps. Your daddy's very smart." Emily reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to Rebecca. "I made this for you." Rebecca unfolded it carefully. The drawing showed 3 figures standing under an arch of golden lights: a tall man, a small girl, and a woman with long dark hair. Above them, a single purple star. Rebecca's throat worked as she swallowed. "This is beautiful. Who's the star?" "That's my mommy. She's watching from heaven." Emily's voice was matter-of-fact, the way only a 6-year-old could be about something so enormous. "She wants Daddy to be happy, and I think she'd like you." Rebecca looked up at James, her eyes bright with something he couldn't name. He saw her struggling to find words that wouldn't break in her mouth. "Thank you, Emily. I'll keep this safe." Emily nodded, satisfied, and turned her attention to the breakfast bar. Rebecca stood slowly, still holding the drawing like it might disintegrate if she moved too fast. "She's remarkable. She sees things most people miss." James kept his voice low. "Always has." "Where does she get that from?" "Her mother." They stood in silence for a moment, watching Emily debate between a muffin and a croissant, with the seriousness of a contract negotiation. Rebecca folded the drawing carefully and slipped it into her pocket. "I need to talk to you. Later, when you have time. I'll make time." Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her expression shifted into something harder. "I have to take this." She walked toward the hall, already answering before she was out of earshot. James caught the tail end of her greeting. "Yes, Richard," before she disappeared around the corner. He got Emily settled at a table with food and a glass of orange juice, then stepped outside into the cold. The sky was painfully blue, the kind of clarity that only came after a storm had scrubbed the air clean. He walked down toward the bridge site, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, his breath fogging in the mountain air. The crew had the area cordoned off with yellow caution tape. The gap where the wooden deck had been was a raw wound of broken pilings and exposed rebar. The river below ran fast and dark, still swollen from 2 days of rain. One of the county engineers waved James over. "We're looking at 48 hours minimum for the temporary span. Maybe 72 if the supplier can't get the materials up here." James nodded. "What do you need from me?" "Survey data on the load-bearing capacity of the existing pylons, and we'll need a staging area for the crane. I'll get you both by end of day." He spent the next 3 hours running calculations and coordinating with his crew. By the time he made it back to the resort, it was past noon. Emily was in the great room with a group of other kids, building a fort out of chairs and tablecloths under the supervision of one of the bridesmaids. She waved when she saw him, then went back to her construction project. James found Rebecca in the small office behind the front desk, staring at her laptop screen with the kind of intensity that meant she was either solving a problem or creating one. She looked up when he knocked on the doorframe. "Come in. Close the door." He did. The office was cramped and smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. Rebecca shut the laptop and leaned back in her chair. "Richard's attorney sent a formal demand letter this morning. He's threatening to sue the resort for breach of contract. $500,000 in damages. Negligence. failure to provide adequate facilities, emotional distress. The works. James pulled the second chair over and sat. He won't win, I know. My father already told me the same thing. But the lawsuit itself will tie us up in court for months, and the publicity will damage the brand. Richard knows that. This isn't about winning, it's about punishment. For what? Choosing not to get on a helicopter? For embarrassing him in front of his board? For making him look weak? James studied her face. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. You knew he was like this before yesterday. I did. She rubbed her eyes. I just didn't let myself see it. Or maybe I didn't care because it was easier to focus on work than deal with the fact that I was about to marry someone I didn't love. Why were you going to marry him? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. Because it made sense on paper. Because my father approved. Because I thought if I built the perfect life from the outside in, eventually the inside would follow. Did it? No. James let the silence sit between them. Outside the window, he could hear the muted sounds of the resort coming back to life. Staff moving equipment, guests laughing, the distant hum of the generator. I have time-stamped photos of the pavilion failure, maintenance logs on the transformer and generator, records showing the original contractor abandoned the site, weather data, everything you need to kill this lawsuit before it gets off the ground. Rebecca looked at him. Why are you helping me? Because you didn't ask for any of this, and because you deserve better than being punished for making the right choice. She stood and crossed to the window, arms wrapped around herself. I don't know what I'm doing, James. With the company, with my life, with... She gestured vaguely between them. This, you don't have to know yet, don't I? 300 people just watched me cancel my wedding and publicly thank the man I used to date. Richard's going to use that. He'll twist it into some narrative about me being unstable or unprofessional or... Let him try. You've got 300 witnesses who saw you choose people over optics. That's not a scandal. That's leadership. Rebecca turned to face him. You always did that. Made things sound simpler than they were. Some things are simple. You just get told they're complicated by people who want you confused. Before she could respond, the office door swung open. Emily stood in the doorway, her face flushed with excitement. Daddy, Miss Rebecca, we built the biggest fort ever and you have to come see it. James stood. We're on our way, baby. Emily grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the great room. Rebecca followed a few steps behind, and when James glanced back, she was smiling, small and real. The fort was, in fact, impressively large. 4 kids had pooled their chairs and tablecloths to create a sprawling structure that occupied a full quarter of the room. Emily led them inside with the pride of a general surveying conquered territory. This is the castle, and that part is the dragon's cave, and over there is where the princess lives. Which one are you? Rebecca crouched beside Emily, genuinely curious. I'm the knight. Emily said it like it was obvious. The princess can save herself. Rebecca laughed, bright and unguarded. James felt the sound settle somewhere in his chest. They stayed in the fort for 20 minutes, Emily narrating an elaborate story involving dragons, treasure, and a climactic battle that required James to play the role of a defeated ogre. When they finally emerged, Emily's hair was wild and her cheeks were pink, and she looked happier than she had in weeks. James walked Rebecca back toward the office. Emily ran ahead to rejoin the other kids. Thank you for that. For what? For playing along. For not treating her like she's fragile. She's not fragile. She's a fighter. Rebecca stopped walking. So are you. Had to be. They reached the office door. Rebecca hesitated, her hand on the frame. Will you stay for dinner? With Emily, as my guests. We don't want to impose. You're not. I want you here. James held her gaze. Then we'll stay. Dinner was set up in the great room again. Smaller this time, maybe 60 people total. The kitchen had gone all out, turning the leftover wedding provisions into a proper meal. James sat with Emily at a long table near the fireplace. Rebecca joined them after making rounds to check on guests. Thomas Mitchell appeared a few minutes later, carrying a glass of red wine and moving with the deliberate ease of a man who'd spent decades commanding courtrooms. He sat down across from James without asking permission. "Mr. Carter, mind if I join you?" "It's your resort, sir." Thomas smiled faintly. "My daughter's resort. I just pay for the good wine." Emily looked up from her plate. "Are you Miss Rebecca's daddy?" "I am. She's nice. I gave her a picture." "I heard. That was very kind of you." Thomas turned his attention to James. "I understand you're handling the bridge survey. County needs load-bearing data on the pylons. I'll have it to them by tomorrow. Efficient. Just doing the job." Thomas took a sip of his wine, his eyes sharp over the rim of the glass. "Richard Anderson sent a rather aggressive legal letter this morning. I assume my daughter told you." "She did, and you offered to provide documentation." "Evidence, not documentation. There's a difference." Thomas set his glass down carefully. "Explain." "Documentation supports a narrative. Evidence proves a fact. Richard's lawsuit relies on narrative, negligence, emotional harm, subjective claims. I have facts, structural photos with timestamps, signed contractor abandonment forms, weather service data, generator maintenance logs. None of it is arguable." "And you're willing to testify if it goes to court?" "If it gets that far, but it won't." Thomas studied him for a long moment. "Most men in your position would stay out of it. Avoid the liability exposure." "I'm not most men." "No, you're not." Emily tugged on James's sleeve. "Daddy, can I have dessert? Finish your vegetables first." She made a face but dutifully returned to her plate. Thomas watched the exchange with something that might have been approval. "My daughter has spent the last 10 years building walls. Very effective walls. I was starting to think she'd forgotten how to let anyone through." James didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound presumptuous. "You're good for her." Thomas said it quietly, almost to himself. "You don't try to fix her. You just stand next to her and build something stable. She doesn't need fixing." "No, she needs someone who understands that." Thomas stood, picked up his wine, and walked away without another word. James watched him go, then looked across the room to where Rebecca was talking to a pair of elderly guests. She caught his eye and smiled. Small, private, meant only for him. After dinner, James got Emily ready for bed in the office. She'd claimed the leather sofa as her own at this point, and he'd brought extra blankets from his truck to make it more comfortable. He tucked her in and sat on the edge of the cushions. "Can we stay here tomorrow too? We'll see. Depends on when the bridge gets fixed." "I like it here." Emily's voice was already drowsy. "Miss Rebecca's nice, and the other kids are fun. I'm glad." "Daddy?" "Yeah, baby. Do you think Mommy's happy that we're here?" James felt his throat tighten. He reached down and smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "I think Mommy wants us to be happy, and if being here makes us happy, then yeah, I think she's happy too." "Okay." Emily's eyes drifted shut. "I love you, Daddy. I love you too." He waited until her breathing evened out, then stood and turned off the lamp. The hallway outside was quiet. Most of the guests had retreated to their rooms. James walked through the lodge, checking locks and making sure the generator was running smooth. Old habits from his years in construction. Always do a final walkthrough before calling it a night. He found Rebecca on the back patio, wrapped in a wool coat, staring out at the dark line of mountains against the starlit sky. She didn't turn when he stepped outside, but she shifted slightly to make room beside her at the railing. "Couldn't sleep? Didn't try. Too much in my head." James leaned against the rail beside her. "Want to talk about it?" Richard called again. "After dinner. He said he's willing to drop the lawsuit if I sign a non-disclosure agreement and return all the gifts he gave me over the last 2 years. That's not a settlement. That's a gag order." "I know." "What did you tell him? That I'd talk to my attorney? And now I'm out here trying to figure out why I'm even considering it." James turned to look at her. "Because you're tired. Because fighting sounds exhausting. Because some part of you still thinks you owe him something for wasting his time." Rebecca's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You don't pull punches, do you? Not when it matters." She was quiet for a moment, her breath fogging in the cold air. "He offered me an exit, a clean break. No court, no media, no damage to the company. All I have to do is agree never to talk about what happened. And you're tempted. I'm practical. There's a difference." "Is there?" Rebecca turned to face him, her expression difficult to read in the shadows. "What would you do? I'd tell him to take his NDA and his lawsuit and his ego and get the hell off my mountain. But I'm not you." "No, you're not." She pulled her coat tighter. "You're the kind of person who fixes diesel generators in a rainstorm and builds altars for weddings that don't happen and refuses $50,000 bribes because you have dignity." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. "I don't know how to be that kind of person, James. I know how to negotiate contracts and manage boards and make everything look perfect from the outside. But I don't know how to just," she gestured helplessly, "stand in the truth and let the chips fall. You did it yesterday, when you got off the phone with Richard and took off that ring. That was desperation, not courage. Sometimes they're the same thing." Rebecca looked at him, and in the dim light from the lodge windows he saw the exhaustion and fear she'd been holding back. "I'm scared. Of the lawsuit. Of what people will say, of screwing this up and dragging you and Emily into my mess. Then be scared. But don't let him buy your silence. What if he wins? He won't. Not if you fight. How do you know? Because I have the evidence, and because the truth is louder than his money." Rebecca stepped closer, close enough that he could see the faint tremor in her shoulders. "Why are you doing this?" James thought about lying, about giving her something safe and professional and distant. But they were past that now. "Because 3 years ago I walked away when I should have stayed, and I'm not making that mistake twice." She reached up and touched his face, light, tentative, like she was testing whether he was real. "James." He covered her hand with his. "Yeah. I don't want this to be an act." "Say it again." Her breath hitched. "I don't want this to be an act. I want this to be real. Then let it be real." He kissed her the way he should have 3 years ago, slow and sure and with no room left for doubt. She leaned into him, her hands fisting in his jacket, and for the first time since he'd walked away, something in his chest finally settled. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his shoulder. "I have no idea what I'm doing." "Neither do I." "That's terrifying." "Yeah, it is." They stood like that for a long time, the cold biting at their skin and the stars wheeling overhead. Eventually, Rebecca pulled back just enough to look at him. "Stay. Tonight. Not in the office, in the guest suite upstairs. Emily is fine. She's asleep, and you need actual rest, not a night on that couch." James hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." Rebecca led him inside and up the back stairs to the second floor. The guest suite was larger than his entire cabin, king bed, sitting area, fireplace. She turned on a single lamp and stood by the door. "I'll be down the hall if you need anything." "Rebecca," she stopped. "Thank you. For this. For everything." She smiled, small and tired. "Get some sleep, James." After she left, he stood in the middle of the room and tried to process the last 48 hours. 2 days ago, he'd been sanding furniture in his shop. Now he was standing in a guest suite at the resort his ex-girlfriend owned, having just kissed her for the second time in 3 years, and preparing to help her fight a lawsuit from the man she'd almost married. He should have felt overwhelmed. Instead, he felt clear. He checked his phone. 3 missed calls from his crew foreman and a text from the county engineer asking for the pylon survey data. He sent a quick reply promising the files by morning, then set an alarm and collapsed onto the bed fully clothed. Sleep came fast and heavy, the kind of exhaustion-driven oblivion that didn't allow for dreams. He woke to someone pounding on the door. The room was still dark. His phone said 4:47 a.m. James rolled out of bed and opened the door to find Rebecca standing in the hallway, fully dressed, her face pale. "Emily's missing." The words hit him like cold water. "What? I went to check on her 10 minutes ago. She's not in the office. I've looked everywhere on the first floor." James was already moving, pulling on his boots, his mind running through possibilities. She wouldn't have gone outside. Not in the dark, not alone, unless she was looking for something, or someone. He ran down the stairs 2 at a time, Rebecca right behind him. The lodge was silent except for the hum of the generator. James checked the office first, blankets rumpled, purple blanket gone. He moved methodically through the building, calling Emily's name, his voice echoing off stone and timber. Nothing. He pushed through the side door onto the patio. The air was freezing, the sky just starting to lighten at the edges. His breath came out in harsh clouds. "Emily! Daddy!" The voice came from the direction of the great room. James sprinted back inside and found Emily standing in front of the cedar arch, wrapped in her purple blanket, tears streaming down her face. "Baby, what's wrong? I had a bad dream. About Mommy." She was sad. Emily's voice broke. "I came here because this is where you were happy yesterday, and I thought maybe Mommy could see it and be happy too." James dropped to his knees and pulled her into his arms. She was shaking, from cold or fear or both. Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her hand pressed to her chest like she was trying to catch her breath. "Mommy's not sad, baby, I promise." "How do you know?" "Because Mommy loved you more than anything in the world, and seeing you safe and strong and brave, that's all she ever wanted." Emily pulled back just enough to look at him. "Even if you like Miss Rebecca? Even then? Especially then?" Rebecca moved closer slowly like she was approaching something fragile. Emily looked up at her, eyes red and swollen. "I'm sorry I scared you." Rebecca knelt beside James. "You didn't scare me." "Well, you did, but only because I was worried about you. Daddy says Mommy's happy. Do you think she is?" Rebecca glanced at James, then back at Emily. "I think your Mommy loved your daddy very much. And I think she'd want him to be happy. And you too. Even if it means you're here, especially if it means I'm here." Emily considered this with the gravity of someone much older. "Okay, then you can stay." Rebecca's eyes went bright. "Thank you." James stood, lifting Emily with him. "Let's get you back to bed." They walked together to the office, Emily's head on James's shoulder, Rebecca a step behind. When they got Emily settled again, she reached out and caught Rebecca's hand. "Will you stay? Until I fall asleep?" Rebecca looked at James. He nodded. "Of course." She sat on the floor beside the sofa, Emily's small hand in hers, and hummed something soot and tuneless until the girl's breathing evened out. James watched from the doorway, his heart doing something complicated in his chest. When Emily was fully asleep, Rebecca stood carefully and followed James into the hallway. He closed the door most of the way and leaned against the wall. "I'm sorry. She's never done that before." "Don't apologize." Rebecca's voice was steady, but he could see the emotion working beneath the surface. She was scared. She needed comfort. She thinks her mother's watching. "Maybe she is. You believe that?" "I don't know what I believe, but I know Emily does, and that's enough." They walked back upstairs together in silence. At the door to Rebecca's suite, she stopped. "I meant what I said, about wanting this to be real. I know. I'm still figuring out what that means, so am I." She reached for his hand, laced her fingers through his. "Stay." It wasn't a question, but James answered anyway. "Okay." They went inside. The room was dark except for the faint glow of pre-dawn light through the windows. Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off her boots. James stayed by the door, suddenly uncertain. "You can sit down. I'm not going to bite." He crossed to the bed and sat beside her, leaving a careful foot of space between them. Rebecca turned to face him. "Tell me about her. Sarah, what do you want to know?" "Everything. What she was like, how you met, what happened." James was quiet for a long moment, gathering the pieces of a story he usually kept locked away. "We met in college. She was studying education. I was doing construction work to pay tuition. She used to come to the site on her lunch breaks and bring me sandwiches." Rebecca smiled faintly. "That sounds like something Emily would do. She got it from Sarah. That instinct to take care of people." "What happened?" "After college, we got married young, 23. Everyone told us we were crazy, but we didn't care. She got a teaching job. I started my carpentry business. We had Emily a few years later." "And the diagnosis?" "Emily was 2 when they found the heart defect. Sarah was 30 when they found the cancer. Stage 4 breast cancer, metastatic. By the time they caught it, there was nothing they could do except manage the pain." "How long?" 6 months. "From diagnosis to—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "To the end." "I'm sorry." Rebecca's voice was so quiet he almost didn't hear it. "She made me promise I'd be happy again, that I'd let Emily teach me how to live without her." James looked down at his hands. "I spent 3 years trying to figure out what that meant. And now? Now I think maybe it means this. Being here. With you." Rebecca reached for his hand again. "I don't know how to be what you need. You don't have to be Sarah, you just have to be here. I can do that." She leaned into him, her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that as the sun came up over the mountains and turned the sky from black to gold. The temporary steel bridge span arrived on a flatbed truck 3 days after the storm, escorted by county engineers and a crane operator who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. James stood at the edge of the gap with his survey equipment, double-checking load calculations while the crew prepped the site. The November air had teeth now, sharp and dry, carrying the promise of winter down from the peaks. Behind him, the resort had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Most of the wedding guests had departed once the bridge was operational, but a handful remained, including Thomas Mitchell and Rebecca's younger sister, who'd flown in from Boston the day after the helicopter incident. The press had gotten wind of the canceled wedding, and Rebecca's phone hadn't stopped ringing with calls from reporters, board members, and Richard's increasingly hostile attorneys. James had spent the morning dodging questions from a journalist who'd somehow talked her way past the front desk. He'd referred her to Rebecca's publicist and gone back to work, but the encounter left him unsettled. This was Rebecca's world. Press releases and damage control and carefully managed narratives. He built things with his hands. The gap between those realities felt wider every hour. His phone buzzed. Text from Rebecca. "Conference room, now. Bring the documentation." James packed up his equipment and headed back to the lodge. The conference room was on the 2nd floor, a glass-walled space with a view of the valley and a long table that could seat 20. When he walked in, he found Rebecca at the head of the table, her father to her right, and 2 people he didn't recognize, a woman in her 50s wearing a charcoal suit and a younger man with a laptop open in front of him. Rebecca stood. "James, this is Catherine Wu, our general counsel, and Derek Chen, her associate." Catherine, Derek, this is James Carter. He's the master contractor and the person who has the evidence we discussed. Catherine extended a hand across the table, firm grip, assessing eyes. Mr. Carter, Rebecca tells me you have documentation that could be useful in responding to Mr. Anderson's lawsuit. Evidence, not documentation. Catherine's eyebrow lifted slightly. Explain the distinction. James pulled a thumb drive from his pocket and set it on the table. Documentation supports a story someone wants to tell. Evidence proves what actually happened. Richard Anderson's lawsuit claims the resort was negligent and failed to provide safe facilities. I have time-stamped photos showing the pavilion was structurally compromised by substandard materials used by the original contractor, who abandoned the site before the failure. I have weather service data confirming the storm exceeded normal parameters. I have maintenance logs showing the backup generator was serviced on schedule and failed due to sediment contamination in the fuel line, which I cleared and documented. I have the signed red tag notice I posted on the pavilion, witnessed by 3 staff members. None of it is subjective. Derek reached for the thumb drive. May I? James nodded. Derek plugged it into his laptop and began scrolling through files. His expression remained neutral, but James saw the slight tension leave his shoulders as he reviewed the data. This is comprehensive. Catherine leaned over to look at the screen. You kept records of everything, I always do. Comes with the job, and you're willing to testify if this goes to trial? If it gets that far. But it won't. Catherine sat back in her chair. Why are you so certain? Because Richard Anderson isn't suing over negligence. He's suing because his ego got bruised in front of important people. When he realizes we have airtight documentation of every decision made during the crisis, and when he understands that taking this to court means those same important people will see exactly how he abandoned 300 guests to save his own reputation, he'll withdraw. Rebecca was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Catherine glanced at her, then back at James. Mr. Carter, I appreciate your confidence, but litigation is rarely that straightforward. Then you haven't dealt with men like Richard before. I have. They're loud until you make them prove their claims under oath. Then they get quiet. Catherine was silent for a moment. Derek, make copies of everything on that drive. Flag the photos with metadata intact and pull the weather data into a separate report. I want a response brief drafted by end of week. Derek nodded and returned to his laptop. Catherine turned to Rebecca. With this evidence, we have a strong position to file a motion to dismiss. If Anderson wants to proceed, he'll have to demonstrate actual damages, which he can't do. The wedding was canceled due to force majeure, the storm and bridge failure. No court will find the resort liable for an act of God. What about the emotional distress claim? Rebecca's voice was controlled, but James heard the thread of tension underneath. Unquantifiable and unprovable, especially since he chose to leave the property while you stayed to manage the crisis. If anything, his actions demonstrate a lack of genuine emotional investment in the relationship. Thomas Mitchell spoke for the first time since James had entered the room. There's another issue we need to address. He slid a printed email across the table to Catherine. Richard sent this to 3 members of our board this morning. He's threatening a secondary lawsuit alleging that Rebecca's decision to cancel the wedding constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty to shareholders. James felt his jaw tighten. On what grounds? That the scandal damages the company's reputation and therefore shareholder value. Thomas's voice was dry, clinical. It's a nuisance claim designed to create pressure. Catherine scanned the email. This is aggressive even by corporate litigation standards. He's trying to force a settlement. He won't get one. Rebecca's voice cut through the room like a blade. I'm not paying him to go away. The room went quiet. Derek stopped typing. Catherine set down the email and looked at Rebecca with something that might have been respect. Understood. Then we fight both claims. I'll need a full accounting of the company's financials post-incident to demonstrate no material impact on shareholder value. Derek, coordinate with the CFO. Derek made a note. Catherine turned back to James. Mr. Carter, I may need you available for a deposition if Anderson's attorneys push this forward. I'll make time. Good. Catherine stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Rebecca, I'll have a draft response to you by Friday. In the meantime, no public statements. Refer all press inquiries to our communications team. Understood. After Catherine and Derek left, James remained seated while Thomas gathered his papers. The older man paused at the door. You handled that well. I just told the truth. Most people struggle with that in legal settings. Thomas's mouth quirked. You didn't. He left, and suddenly James was alone with Rebecca. She was staring at the closed laptop on the table, her hands folded in front of her. You okay? No. Her voice was quiet. Richard's trying to destroy me. Not just the wedding, not just my reputation. He's going after the company my father built. He's bluffing. Is he? Rebecca looked up, and James saw the exhaustion in her eyes. He has connections, resources, a legal team that could drag this out for years. What if Catherine's wrong? What if he can prove damages? He can't, because there aren't any. How do you know? Because I was there. I saw what happened. I documented it. And when a judge or jury sees that evidence, they'll see a man who abandoned his fiancé and 300 guests to protect his own interests, then tried to weaponize the legal system when she refused to cover for him. Rebecca stood and walked to the window. The valley stretched out below, the new bridge a silver line across the river. I keep thinking about what you said, about truth being louder than money. You don't believe it? I want to, but I've spent 10 years in a world where money writes the truth. Then maybe it's time to work somewhere else. She turned. What does that mean? It means you don't have to keep playing a game you don't believe in. Easy for you to say. This is my family's legacy, my father's life's work. I can't just walk away because it's hard. I'm not asking you to walk away. I'm asking if you're fighting for the company or fighting to prove something to people whose opinions don't matter. Rebecca's expression shuddered. You don't understand. Then help me understand. She crossed her arms, defensive. You get to build things with your hands and go home at the end of the day. I have shareholders, boards, employees whose livelihoods depend on the decisions I make. I don't get to just what? Choose yourself? The words hung between them, sharp and true. Rebecca's shoulders dropped. I don't know how. James stood and closed the distance between them. You did it 4 days ago when you took off that ring. That was desperation. Maybe. But it was also the first honest thing you'd done in years. She looked at him, her eyes bright. What if I can't do it again? What if I freeze when it matters? Then you'll unfreeze and try again. That's how it works. You make it sound simple. It is simple. It's just not easy. Rebecca reached for his hand, laced her fingers through his. I'm scared, James, I know. What if I lose, the company, the lawsuit, everything? Then you'll rebuild. People do it every day, have you? After Sarah died? Yeah, I rebuilt. It looked different than what I had before, but it was mine, and it was real. Rebecca leaned into him, her forehead against his shoulder. I don't know if I'm strong enough. You are. You just don't trust it yet. They stood like that for a long moment, the afternoon light slanting through the window, turning everything gold. Finally, Rebecca pulled back. Emily's been asking for you. Where is she? Great room. Building another fort with some of the staff's kids. James smiled despite himself. She's made friends. She has your gift for it. They walked downstairs together. The great room had been transformed again. this time into what appeared to be an elaborate blanket city complete with towers, tunnels, and a central keep made from overturned chairs. Emily was in the middle of it all, directing operations like a tiny general. When she saw James, her face lit up. "Daddy, come see what we made." He ducked into the fort and let her show him every detail. The secret passage behind the fireplace, the lookout tower by the window, the dragon's lair under the piano. Rebecca followed, crouching to fit through the low doorways, and James watched her transform from CEO to co-conspirator, asking Emily serious questions about structural integrity and defensive positions. After an hour, the other kids were called away for dinner and the fort began to empty. Emily curled up in the central keep with her purple blanket, suddenly exhausted. James sat beside her while Rebecca started carefully dismantling the outer walls. "Daddy? Yeah, baby. Are we going home soon?" "Tomorrow, probably. The bridge is almost done." Emily was quiet for a moment. "I don't want to leave Miss Rebecca." James felt his chest tighten. "We'll see her again. Promise?" "Yeah, I promise." Emily seemed satisfied with that. She closed her eyes, and within minutes, she was asleep. Rebecca appeared in the doorway of the fort, a stack of folded blankets in her arms. "She's out. Long day." They moved carefully around the sleeping child, putting the room back in order. When they finished, James lifted Emily, still wrapped in her purple blanket, and carried her to the office. Rebecca followed and watched from the doorway as he settled his daughter on the couch. "She trusts you. She's 6. She trusts everyone." "No, she doesn't." Rebecca's voice was soft. "She's careful, watchful. But with you, she's just herself. That's what kids should be. Most aren't. I wasn't." James straightened and turned to face her. "What were you like as a kid? Anxious? Perfectionist? Always trying to earn approval I never quite got?" "From who?" "My father. My teachers, myself." "You got it now. Your father approves. He approves of my work. That's different than approving of me." James crossed to where she stood. "You know that's not true." Rebecca looked away. "When I was 12, my mother left. She said she couldn't do it anymore. The pressure, the expectations, the life my father built. She moved to California and remarried someone who owned a bookstore. I saw her twice after that before she died. I'm sorry. I spent years trying to understand what was so wrong with the life we had that she couldn't stay. And the only answer I could come up with was that I wasn't enough. That if I'd been better, smarter, less difficult, she would have stayed. That's not how it works. I know that now. But 12-year-old me didn't. Is that why you were going to marry Richard? Because you thought you had to be perfect? Partly, and partly because being perfect felt safer than being real. And now I'm terrified. Because real means people can see all the ways you're broken. James reached for her hand. Everyone's broken. The people who pretend they're not are just better liars. She looked at him, and something in her expression cracked open. Teach me. Teach you what? How to be real. How to stop performing. How to just exist without armor. James pulled her closer. You're doing it right now. This doesn't feel real. This feels like free fall. Same thing. He kissed her then, slow and deliberate, and felt her relax into it, like she'd been holding her breath for years and finally remembered how to exhale. When they pulled apart, she rested her head against his chest. Stay tonight, in my room. Not the guest suite. What about Emily? She'll be fine. The office is right downstairs. We'll hear her if she needs us. James hesitated, then nodded. Okay. They went upstairs together, Rebecca's hand in his. Her suite was smaller than the guest room, more personal, with books stacked on the nightstand and photographs on the dresser. James recognized Thomas Mitchell in several of them, younger and smiling. There was one of Rebecca and a woman who must have been her mother. both of them at the beach, squinting into the sun. That was the last good summer. Rebecca followed his gaze. Before she left, "You look like her." "Everyone says that. It's true." Rebecca turned away from the photo and started pulling off her boots. "I don't want to talk about my mother tonight." "What do you want to talk about?" "Nothing. I just want to be here. With you. Without thinking about lawsuits or boards or the 1,000 ways this could go wrong." James pulled off his own boots and sat on the edge of the bed. "Then we won't think about any of it." She climbed onto the bed beside him and curled into his side. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders and felt the tension slowly drain from her body. They lay like that in the dark, listening to the sounds of the lodge settling around them, old wood creaking, the generator humming, wind moving through the eaves. "Tell me something true." Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. "About what?" "Anything. Something you've never told anyone." James thought for a long moment. "When Sarah died, I was angry, not sad. Angry at her for leaving, at God for taking her, at myself for not being able to fix it. I spent 6 months barely holding it together, and the only reason I didn't fall apart completely was because Emily needed me. And after? After I realized being angry was easier than being sad, so I stayed angry. At everything. Until one day Emily asked me why I didn't smile anymore, and I couldn't give her an answer that made sense. When did you stop being angry? I don't know if I have, but I'm working on it. Rebecca was quiet. Then, I'm glad you're here. Me too. She fell asleep sometime after midnight, her breathing evening out against his chest. James stayed awake longer, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Sarah and Emily and the woman currently asleep in his arms. He wasn't sure what he was doing. He wasn't sure any of this made sense, but for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he was moving towards something instead of just away from the past. He woke to sunlight streaming through the window and Rebecca already dressed, standing by the bed with a mug of coffee in her hand. Morning. James sat up, disoriented. What time is it? 7. I let you sleep. You looked like you needed it. He rubbed his face. I should check on Emily. Already did. She's in the kitchen helping the staff make pancakes. Of course she is. Rebecca handed him the coffee. Catherine called. Richard's attorneys want to meet. When? This afternoon. Here. James took a sip of the coffee. Black, the way he liked it. That was fast. Too fast. Catherine thinks they're trying to intimidate us by showing up in person. Let them come. You sound confident. I have the evidence. They have a bruised ego and a weak case. Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed. I need you in that meeting. You sure? This is your company, your fight, and you're the one with the proof. Besides, she looked at him directly, I do better when you're there. James set down the coffee. Okay, I'll be there. The meeting was set for 2 o'clock in the same conference room where they'd met with Catherine 3 days earlier. James spent the morning with Emily helping her finish the pancakes and then walking down to the bridge site to oversee the final installation. The steel span was in place now, bolted to the concrete pylons, and the county engineers were running stress tests. By the time he got back to the lodge, cleaned up and changed into the one dress shirt he kept in his truck, it was 1:45. He found Rebecca in her office, staring at her laptop with the kind of intensity that meant she was either composing an email or drafting a battle plan. They're early, waiting in the conference room. How many? 3. Richard, his lead attorney, and someone Catherine doesn't recognize. James straightened his collar. Then let's not keep them waiting. They walked upstairs together. Catherine and Derek were already in the conference room, seated on one side of the table. Across from them sat Richard Anderson, tall, polished, expensively suited, flanked by a silver-haired man in his 60s and a younger woman with a leather portfolio. Richard's eyes went to James immediately, cold and assessing. Then he looked at Rebecca. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Rebecca took the seat at the head of the table. James sat beside her. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Richard. Why are you here?" The silver-haired attorney spoke first. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Leonard Hartman representing Mr. Anderson. We're here to discuss a resolution that benefits all parties." Catherine's voice was crisp. "You filed a lawsuit alleging negligence and emotional distress. If you want to discuss resolution, withdraw the suit." Hartman smiled, thin and cold. "We're prepared to do that, in exchange for certain considerations." "Such as?" "A public statement from Ms. Mitchell acknowledging that the wedding cancellation was a mutual decision, a return of all gifts exchanged during the engagement, and a signed non-disclosure agreement regarding the events of November 7th through 10th. Catherine didn't blink. "That's not a settlement. That's a gag order designed to protect your client's reputation at the expense of my client's credibility." "We're offering a clean exit," Mr. Hartman continued. "No prolonged litigation. No media circus. Miss Mitchell signs the NDA, returns the gifts, releases a joint statement, and we all move forward." Rebecca leaned back in her chair. "And if I refuse? Then we proceed with the lawsuit, and we'll be adding a secondary claim for breach of fiduciary duty based on your decision to prioritize a personal relationship over corporate responsibility." James felt his jaw tighten. He looked at Richard. "You mean the personal relationship where I refused your $50,000 bribe?" The room went very quiet. Hartman's expression didn't change, but the younger woman's hand stilled on her portfolio. "I don't know what you're referring to." Richard's voice was smooth, controlled. James pulled his phone from his pocket, opened the voice memo app, and pressed play. The recording was clear, James's voice, then Richard's, tinny through the phone speaker. "Marcus Hayes, right? The contractor. I'll wire you $50,000 if you convince her to get on that helicopter. I don't take bribes from men who treat women like assets. Everyone has a price. Mine is higher than your character can afford." James stopped the recording. "I keep records, same as everything else." Hartman's face had gone carefully neutral. "That recording was made without Mr. Anderson's consent. It's inadmissible. Actually, Colorado is a one-party consent state." Catherine's voice was pleasant. "As long as one party to the conversation consents to the recording, which Mr. Carter did since he was part of the conversation, it's perfectly admissible. In fact, it's evidence of attempted bribery, which undermines your entire negligence claim." Richard's composure cracked slightly. That conversation was taken out of context. "Was it?" James kept his voice level. "Because it sounds to me like you tried to pay me to manipulate Rebecca into abandoning 300 people so you could protect your public image. And when I refused, you chartered a helicopter and left anyway." The younger woman was typing rapidly on her laptop. Hartman held up a hand. "Let's take a step back. Clearly there are misunderstandings that need to be addressed." "There's no misunderstanding." Catherine opened her own laptop and turned it to face Hartman. "We have time-stamped photographic evidence of the pavilion failure caused by substandard materials used by the original contractor who abandoned the site. We have weather service data showing the storm exceeded normal parameters. We have maintenance records proving the backup generator was properly serviced. We have witness statements from 300 guests confirming that Mr. Anderson left the property while Ms. Mitchell stayed to manage the crisis. And now we have audio evidence of your client attempting to bribe a resort contractor." She leaned forward. "If you take this to trial, a jury will hear all of it, and they'll see exactly what kind of man Richard Anderson is." Hartman's jaw worked. After a moment, he turned to Richard and spoke in a low voice James couldn't hear. Richard's face went red, but he nodded. Hartman turned back to the table. "We'll need time to consult with our client. Take all the time you need." Catherine's smile was sharp. "But understand, every day you delay, we're adding documentation to our countersuit, Attempted bribery, defamation, abuse of process. Mr. Carter's testimony alone will destroy your negligence claim, and once that falls apart, the breach of fiduciary duty claim collapses with it. You have no case. You never did. Richard stood abruptly. Sit down, Richard. Everyone turned. Thomas Mitchell stood in the doorway, his expression carved from stone. Dad, what are you doing here, protecting my company? Thomas walked to the table and placed a manila folder in front of Hartman. Inside, you'll find documentation showing that Richard Anderson purchased 12,000 shares of Mitchell Hospitality stock through a shell corporation 6 months ago. Under Colorado corporate law, any shareholder who acquires more than 5% of a company's stock must disclose that purchase within 10 days. Mr. Anderson failed to do so, which means his breach of fiduciary duty claim, predicated on his supposed concern for shareholder value, is filed by someone who was secretly positioning himself for a hostile takeover. The room went dead silent. Hartman opened the folder, scanned the contents, and slowly closed it. Where did you get this? I'm a retired judge with 40 years of connections in the Colorado legal community. Thomas's voice was mild. Did you really think I wouldn't look into the man trying to marry my daughter? Richard's face had gone white. Those shares were a legitimate investment. Then why hide them behind a shell company? Thomas pulled out a chair and sat. Let me be very clear, Mr. Anderson. You are going to withdraw both lawsuits. You are going to sign a document agreeing never to contact my daughter again. And you are going to sell those shares back to the company at cost. If you refuse, I will personally ensure that every business publication in this country knows you tried to marry into a company so you could steal it from the inside. Hartman stood. Mr. Mitchell, these are serious allegations. They're not allegations, they're facts. And I have a file 3 inches thick to prove it. Richard finally found his voice. You can't. I can, and I will. Hartman gathered his papers. We'll be in touch. You have 24 hours. After that, we file the countersuit. Richard and his legal team left without another word. The door closed behind them and the room exhaled. Rebecca stared at her father. How long have you known? About the shares? 3 months. I was waiting to see if he'd disclose them voluntarily. And when he didn't, I started building the file. Thomas looked at Catherine. Make sure the countersuit is ready. If they don't withdraw by tomorrow, we go nuclear. Understood. Thomas stood and turned to James. Well done with that recording. I thought it might come in handy. Preparation beats luck every time. He left. Catherine and Derek followed, leaving James alone with Rebecca. She was still sitting in her chair, staring at the closed door. Are you okay? I don't know. She looked at him. My father just eviscerated the man I almost married. On my behalf, using evidence he'd been gathering for months without telling me. He was protecting you. I know, but... She stopped, shook her head. I should have seen it. The shares, the takeover attempt, all of it. How could you? He hid it behind a shell company. I'm supposed to be smarter than this. I run a multi-million-dollar corporation. How did I not see that my own fiancé was trying to steal it? Because you wanted to believe he loved you. There's no crime in that. Rebecca's laugh was bitter. Isn't there? James reached for her hand. You made a mistake. You're human. It happens. I almost destroyed everything my father built, but you didn't. You stopped the wedding. You stayed on the mountain. You fought because you were here. No. Because you chose to be. Rebecca looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. What if I keep making mistakes? What if I choose wrong again? Then you'll course correct and keep going. That's what strong people do. I don't feel strong. You are. You just don't see it yet. She stood and walked to the window, arms wrapped around herself. The valley was turning gold in the late afternoon light, shadows stretching across the snow-dusted peaks. I'm stepping back from the CEO role. James went still. What? Not immediately. But within the year, I'm going to transition to a board position and bring in someone else to run day-to-day operations. Why? Because I don't want this life anymore. The constant pressure, the politics, the performance. I want to build something real. What does that look like? I don't know yet, but I want to find out. James crossed to stand beside her. Your father will understand, eventually. She turned to face him. I need to do this, James. For me. Then do it. Just like that? Just like that. She reached for him and he pulled her close. They stood like that for a long time, the light fading outside, the lodge settling into evening quiet. 18 months later, James stood on the porch of his cabin, watching snow fall through the pines. The air was cold and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the stove inside. Behind him, he could hear Emily and Rebecca laughing over some mishap in the kitchen. Burned pancakes, probably, given the smell. The cabin looked different now. Rebecca had moved in 6 months ago, bringing books and photographs and a determination to learn how to cook that remained admirably undeterred by consistent failure. They'd added a second bedroom for Emily, expanded the porch, and built a workshop where Rebecca was learning carpentry with the same focused intensity she'd once brought to quarterly reports. She'd stepped down as CEO 8 months ago and taken a position on Mitchell Hospitality's board. The transition had been rocky. Shareholders initially skeptical, business press questioning her commitment, but the company's numbers had actually improved under new leadership. Rebecca consulted remotely now, advising on strategic decisions while spending most of her time in the mountains. Emily appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her purple blanket. Daddy, Miss Rebecca says breakfast is ready. Is it edible? Emily grinned, gap-toothed and mischievous. Mostly. James followed her inside. Rebecca stood at the stove, flipping what appeared to be pancakes onto a plate. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail and she wore one of his flannel shirts over leggings. She looked younger than she had 18 months ago. Lighter. Don't say anything. She pointed the spatula at him. I wasn't going to. You were thinking it. Maybe. She threw a dish towel at him. He caught it and crossed to the stove, pulling her into a kiss that made Emily giggle from the table. They ate breakfast together. The pancakes were actually decent this time, and afterward Emily ran outside to build a snow fort. Rebecca started washing dishes and James dried, the two of them moving in the easy rhythm of people who'd learned each other's patterns. I talked to my dad yesterday. Rebecca handed him a plate. How's he doing? Good. He wants to know when we're coming down for dinner. Next weekend work? Should. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. He asked when you're going to make an honest woman out of me. James nearly dropped the plate. He what? You heard me. What did you say? That it was none of his business and he should focus on his own love life. Does he have one? Not that I know of, but deflection seemed like the safest option. James set the plate down and turned to face her. Do you want me to? Make an honest woman out of you? Rebecca put down the dish she was washing and looked at him. Are you asking? I'm asking what you want. She dried her hands on a towel, thinking. A year ago, I would have said marriage was a corporate merger with Fleur's, but now, she stepped closer. Now I think maybe it's just a promise to keep choosing each other, even when it's hard. Is that a yes? It's a yes. James pulled the small velvet box from his pocket, the one he'd been carrying for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. Inside was a simple gold band with a small sapphire, the color of mountain twilight. Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth. When did you? 2 weeks ago. I was waiting for you to bring it up first. Why? Because I wanted to make sure you'd choose it, not just accept it. She took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger. Perfect fit. Then, I choose it. I choose you. I choose this. James kissed her, slow and sure, and through the window, he could see Emily building her snow fort in the yard, singing something tuneless and happy. That evening, they drove down to the resort for dinner with Thomas. The bridge had been replaced with a permanent structure 6 months ago, and the great room had become a popular event space. The cedar arch James had built still stood at the far end, used now for weddings and corporate events and anything else that needed a beautiful focal point. Thomas met them in the lobby with glasses of wine already poured. Emily ran ahead to the great room where she'd discovered a basket of building blocks the staff kept for visiting children. "Congratulations." Thomas handed Rebecca her wine. "I assume James told you I've been pestering him for weeks. You're subtle as a freight train, Dad. I'm a father. Subtlety is overrated." They followed Emily to the great room and sat by the fireplace. The space was warm and full, a private party occupying the far end near the arch. Thomas watched his daughter and James with the satisfied expression of a man who'd bet on a long shot and won. "You know, when Rebecca brought you to dinner 3 years ago, I thought you were too quiet, too careful, Dad." "Let me finish. I thought you were a man who'd been hurt and didn't know how to risk it again. Turns out I was right, but what I didn't see was that you were also a man who knew the difference between building something that looks good and building something that lasts." He raised his glass to things that last. They drank. Emily ran over with a block tower she'd constructed, demanding they admire its structural integrity. Rebecca crouched beside her, asking serious questions about foundation and balance. And James watched them together, his daughter and the woman who'd learned to be part of their family without trying to replace anyone. Later, after dinner, Rebecca and Emily walked down to see the new bridge while James helped Thomas carry dishes back to the kitchen. The older man moved slower than he used to, but his mind was still sharp as ever. "She's happy. You know that, right?" "I know. Good. Because if you ever make her unhappy, I still have connections in the Colorado legal system." James smiled. "Noted." Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. "Welcome to the family, son. Officially." They found Rebecca and Emily standing in the middle of the bridge, looking up at the stars. The valley spread out below them, dark and vast and beautiful. James joined them, Rebecca slipping her hand into his, Emily between them talking about constellations she'd learned in school. "Daddy, do you think Mommy can see the stars from heaven?" James looked up. "Yeah, baby, I think she can." "Do you think she's happy we're here?" "I think she's happy we're happy." Emily nodded, satisfied. "Good, because I like it here, with Miss Rebecca, and you, and Grandpa Thomas, and the bridge, and everything. Me too." They stood there for a long time, the three of them, under stars so bright they cast shadows on the snow. Eventually, Emily yawned and they walked back to the lodge to collect their coats. On the drive home, Emily fell asleep in the back seat, wrapped in her purple blanket. Rebecca reached for James's hand across the console. "Thank you." "For what?" "For building something that lasts. We built it together." She smiled. "Yeah, we did." When they got home, James carried Emily inside and tucked her into bed. She stirred just long enough to mumble goodnight, then curled onto her side, already dreaming. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her breathe, feeling the weight of 3 years finally lift. Rebecca was waiting on the porch when he came back out. She'd made tea and brought extra blankets, and they sat together in the cold, watching snow fall through the pines. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The stars wheeled overhead. "I was thinking." Rebecca's voice was quiet. "About what?" "About how 3 years ago I thought I had everything figured out. Career, trajectory, the whole plan, and then it all fell apart. And now I'm sitting on a porch I helped build, wearing a ring I chose, with a man who taught me that love doesn't have to be a performance." She leaned into him. "So I guess what I'm thinking is, falling apart was the best thing that ever happened to me." James wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Same." They sat like that until the cold drove them inside, where the fire was still burning and the house smelled like cedar and home. And later, lying in bed with Rebecca asleep beside him and Emily safe down the hall, James thought about Sarah and the promise he'd made, about being happy again, about letting Emily teach him how. Turns out his daughter had been right all along. Love didn't run out. It just made more room.